All right, 2:02, it is time. Hello everyone, and welcome to today's session of the GLASE Webinar Series. My name is Erico Mattos, and I am the Executive Director of the Greenhouse Lighting and Systems Engineering Consortium, and I will be your host today. The GLASE Webinar Series is a selection of live recorded online presentations that cover a broad range of topics at varying technical and levels. These webinars feature the latest technological innovations and best practices in the CEA field, providing the audience the opportunity to discover new solutions and to connect with field experts, like Dr. Mark Van Eersel. Today, we're gonna hear from Dr. Van Eersel from University of Georgia about the project LAMP, which stands for Lighting Approach to Maximize Profits. Dr. Mark Van Eersel received his PhD from the University of Arkansas in 1994. He has been with the Horticulture Department of the University of Georgia since 1995, where he now holds the Dooley Professorship. His research focuses on cost-effective supplemental lighting technologies in greenhouses and vertical farms. He's the director of the Project LAMP, which is a $5 million US-based research project that brings together plant scientists, engineers, and economists to develop profitable supplemental lighting strategies. In 2017, he co-founded Candidus, a horticultural lighting control company, to help bring novel lighting technologies and strategies to the greenhouse industry. I also would like to mention that Dr. Mark Van Eersel was part of my advisory committee when I was a grad student at University of Georgia. So it is really a privilege for me to have Mark here today, being part of the GLASE webinar series. A recorded version of this webinar will be available at our website, glaze.org, where you can find all the previous webinars and also register for the upcoming ones. If you have any questions about the presentation, or if you'd like to get in contact with a speaker, please submit your inquiries using the Q&A box. We will do our best to answer all your questions at the end of the presentation, and if you cannot do so, we try to follow up by email afterwards. With that said, I would like to thank Dr. Van Eersel for being our presenter today and pass the word. Mark?
Thank you, Erico, for that introduction, and thank you everyone for attending today's webinar. You probably all have more pressing things on your mind right now than lighting, but I appreciate you taking the time out of your schedules to attend today. And so, as Erico mentioned, I am the director of Project LAMP, which is funded by the USDA, and I will give you a little bit of an idea of what we do in this project during today's webinar. Before going into that, what I would like to do is talk very briefly about the team that we have, because one thing that is important to understand is that most of the things that I talk about today are not necessarily things that I have done. What we do is truly a team effort. And so here you can actually see the team members that we have working on this project. We have people from 4 different universities, from the USDA, and at the University of Georgia from a wide range of different departments. That includes horticulture, but also we have 4 engineers working on this project, and you will see why that is so important. Actually, that's 4 engineers just at UGA, and we have 2 other engineers. We have an agricultural economist, and we have people who work in management information systems. And last but not least, we have dedicated people to actually look at the impact of the work that we do. So I'm not going to introduce all of the faculty members on this project individually, but I want you to recognize that we have a wide range of different people working on this. And so then the next question is, what do we actually want to do as part of this project? Well, that's fairly straightforward, at least the overall goal is, and that is what we want to do is to help you make the best possible decisions regarding supplemental or sole source lighting, depending on how you produce crops. And to do that, what we feel is absolutely critical is that we integrate horticulture, engineering, and economics. Because if we only look at one of these 3 fields, I don't think we will ever be able to come up with a truly comprehensive solution for your needs. And so that includes developing hardware, software, and decision support systems to help you make those decisions and then to subsequently implement the best possible lighting strategies that we are developing through our horticultural research. So in this project, we are working both on plant factories as well as greenhouses. So here you can see a picture of aero farms, and lighting is obviously critical in these kinds of systems because these plants don't receive any sunlight. But because these plants don't receive any sunlight, that actually also means that this is a relatively straightforward system to study because we can very precisely control both the light intensity and the light spectrum that plants are exposed to. When you compare that with greenhouses, it turns out, are actually incredibly complicated. And I think this picture from Metrolina greenhouses illustrates that very nicely. So we have hanging baskets hanging over the crop that is sitting on the floor right here. And when you look at that crop that is present on the floor, you can see there are shadows everywhere. Some plants are receiving almost full sun. Other plants are in deep, deep shade. So we have a really complicated environment with lots of spatial variability and lighting, but you can probably also imagine that as the sun is moving across the sky over the course of a day, all of these shadows are moving over the crop. So when you think about managing lighting, I would argue that greenhouses are actually much more complicated systems than plant factories. So during today's webinar, I cannot talk about everything that we do as a team. We actually have a total, including graduate students, of about 50 people working on this project. So I picked 3 topics that I think and hope that will be of interest to you. And those 3 topics are estimating the cost of providing lighting to your crop. I do want to talk after that about the idea of daily light integral and work that we have done that shows that not all daily light integrals are equated equal. And then the last topic of today's webinar will be regarding the use of far red light in horticultural production. Far red has, I think, a pretty bad reputation, and that is, in my opinion, not deserved. And hopefully I will be able to explain to you why I think that that reputation is not deserved. So we'll start off with talking about estimating how much supplemental lighting may actually cost in a specific situation. And so that work was partly inspired by a lighting calculator that was developed by Joanne Logan at the University of Tennessee and Jim Faust at Clemson. They have developed these daily light integral maps, and it is tied to a GPS, the GIS database. It's a really nice website that they developed for this. You can access it at this link right here. And what this map does is for any location in the United States, and you can zoom in on this map as much as you like, you can determine exactly how much light you are likely to receive outside of your greenhouse from the sun. And so at the top right here, you can either see, hopefully you can look at annual light levels, or you can narrow that down for a specific month of the year. So I think this was really well done, but what we felt that we could add to this is, rather than just showing you how much sunlight you have available in your specific location, we wanted to help you determine how much light, supplemental light, you might need to provide to be able to grow the crops that you grow. And so this was work that we have been doing in collaboration with Cornell University. Cale Harbick, one of the collaborators on this project, was at Cornell till very recently and just moved to the USDA Agricultural Research Service. What we worked on was to develop a lighting cost calculator rather than just a lighting calculator. And so what this calculator does and what these maps here show is how much supplemental light would you need to provide over the course of a year in order to make sure that your crop receives every single day at least 17 moles of light. And that 17 moles is a value that is commonly used to grow lettuce, for example. And so the maps that you see here and the different colors, they indicate the total amount of supplemental light that is needed over the course of a whole year for two different situations. The map on the left shows the supplemental lighting need for a greenhouse that has a double layer of poly on the roof, and we assume here that you get 62% of sunlight transmitted into the greenhouse, while the map on the right mimics a situation for a glass covered greenhouse where transmittance might be 70%. And as you can hopefully see in these maps, that if you have more light transmittance, you get more sunlight into the greenhouse, the amount of supplemental light that you need to provide is reduced. And so the scale right here on the right hand side shows the total moles per square meter of supplemental light that you would need to provide over the course of an entire year. And once you know how much supplemental light you need to provide, and you know how efficient your lighting system is, as well as the cost of electricity, it becomes really easy to actually calculate the electricity cost associated with providing that supplemental light. So this is an example for lettuce. When we go to the next slide, here we can see an example for tomatoes, the same two different kinds of greenhouses, but since we're now growing tomatoes, we need more light. So we're assuming here 25 moles per square meter per day. And you see a lot more lighter colors in these maps, indicating that a lot more supplemental light is needed to be able to grow tomatoes as compared to lettuce. So what we have also been working on is to convert these maps into a spreadsheet that you can easily use. In this spreadsheet, you only need to provide 4 parameters for your specific growing conditions. So you need to know the greenhouse transmission, how much of the sunlight actually gets into your greenhouse. You specify the total amount of light that you want, the efficacy of your supplemental lighting system. So here we have a value of 2.8, an efficacy of 2.8 micromoles per joule for supplemental lighting means that you have a pretty efficient LED lighting system. And then you can enter your electricity price right here. And then based on these parameters and the specific location, the software can very easily then calculate the lighting costs that you have over the course of the year. So we go from January through December right here, and we have 5 different locations. That includes Athens, Georgia, just because that's where I happen to be. We also picked Yuma, Arizona, and we picked Arizona because they have so much light, and as you can see, the orange color indicates, as you might expect, a very low supplemental lighting costs. And then we have Seattle, Washington, Elmira, New York, and Kalamazoo, Michigan. Those are all locations, obviously, where you need a lot more supplemental light than you do in Arizona or Georgia. So this illustrates a situation for an efficient LED lighting system. If we then, rather than simulating what you would need to do with an LED lighting system, we now use a double-ended 1000 watt high pressure sodium light, which might have an efficacy of 1.6 micromoles per joule. The spreadsheet then calculates the lighting cost for these high pressure sodium lights. And we can compare the results from the LEDs versus the high pressure sodium lights side by side. The software also makes a graph that shows the annual lighting costs. So we can probably safely ignore Athens and Yuma because that is those are locations where you would likely not use supplemental lighting. But when we look at Seattle, Washington, with this efficient LED lighting system, your annual cost would be a little bit over $40,000 per acre. While in Elmira and Kalamazoo, it turns out that the lighting costs, the electricity, are practically the same, around $34,000 per acre. So when we compare that to the annual cost that you would have with high pressure sodium lights, as you can see here. So when we look at Seattle, Washington, the cost is a little bit over $70,000 per acre. So that is $30,000 in electricity that you would need to pay for with high pressure sodium compared to LED lighting systems. And in Elmira and Kalamazoo, you're looking at an additional electricity cost when you're using these high pressure sodium lights of about $25,000 per acre per year. Now that does not mean necessarily that LEDs are the more economical choice, because you need to also consider the capital expenses associated with installing these lighting systems, and LED lighting is still much more expensive than high pressure sodium. And then you also need to look at maintenance costs. And so what we plan to do in the future is to develop an economics-based decision support system where you can enter some different lighting configurations, and the software will then tell you, will give you a cost comparison for different lighting configurations, because there is a lot more to finding the optimal lighting system than just looking at the electricity costs. So what we hope to soon have available on our website, which is at www.hortlamp.org, and that website will again be on the very last slide of this webinar. We are working on getting online an interactive lighting cost calculator where you can enter the zip code of your particular location. The software will then automatically retrieve weather data for your particular location, and it will do these calculations that you see here for your location. So we're trying to make sure that this is going to be as user-friendly and applicable to your specific greenhouse situation as possible. So in addition to this lighting cost calculator, Neil Madsen at Cornell has developed a different calculator that actually estimates how many light fixtures you may need, and it also does some electricity cost calculations. And in the future, we hope to integrate these two different calculators into a single software program. Neil Madsen's tool right now is also Excel-based. And it's pretty user-friendly, and it is available on the outreach page of the LAMP project, as well as on Cornell's Controlled Environment Agriculture website. But in this particular calculator, you enter how much supplemental light you want to be able to provide. You need to know the light that is provided by a single light. You can either get that from the lighting manufacturer, or the Excel spreadsheet gives some values for some different lights. You specify the area that you want to light, the efficacy of the light. So basically that tells you how much light is produced per unit energy. If you want to, you can make some assumptions about how much of the light is actually lost from the crop, because you're lighting non-target areas, typically at the edge of your greenhouse. You can specify the number of hours per day that the lights are on and the cost of your electricity. And then the software will give you the number of lamps that are needed, either with or without edge effects right here. It tells you how much supplemental light you're capable of providing with that lighting setup, and it provides an estimate of the electricity cost that it would take to actually run these lights. So 2 different tools right now. Hopefully this will in the fairly near future become 1 tool. And one thing that we would actually love to hear from you once we have this tool available online is what other things should this software be able to do for you, because we want to make sure that this calculator provides the information that you need to make the decisions that you need to make. So feedback is going to be very much appreciated. With regard to this Excel tool, Neil Madsen has written an article about that. That article is available at egrow.org under alerts and edibles. I'm sure that Neil could also send it to you directly. I could too if you would like for me to do that. But this explains how you can use that spreadsheet to estimate energy cost as well as the number of lights that you actually need. So again, I want to emphasize these tools are available on the outreach page that we have for Project LAMP. But I would also like to point out that lighting companies have lots of tools available to them that we do not have. And one thing that lighting companies, for example, should be able to do for you that we cannot is to develop lighting plans. So these are images that I got from the Valoya website, where you can specify a specific layout of your lights, and the software can then calculate the light distribution on your crop. And I would say that if you are working with a lighting company that cannot provide these kinds of maps to you, then you're probably working with a lighting company that doesn't really know what they're doing. This is one of the things that I look at when I look at whether or not a lighting company is actually reputable. Can they provide these kinds of lighting plans? They are truly critical for you to develop a good plan for how to install a lighting system. Okay, so from here, I would like to switch gears and talk about the daily light integral. So daily light integral has been around for probably around 30 years or so, and it is commonly used to make recommendations to specify how much light a specific crop needs in order to produce a quality crop. And I do think that these daily light integrals and recommendations based on them are really useful. But one thing that we have been able to show is that not all daily light integrals are created equal. How you provide that light over the course of a day also matters. And so the reason that the daily light integral is so important is that the daily light integral, which is shown on the y-axis in this slide, it changes dramatically over the course of a year. We get, as you might expect, a lot more light in the middle of summer than we do in winter time. But in most locations in the United States, it also changes pretty dramatically from day to day. So when we look at Elmira, New York, for example, you see right here that in the middle of summer in Elmira, you have some days where you actually get less light than you would in some days during the winter time. So there is a tremendous amount of variation from day to day in how much sunlight you get. That is less the case in Phoenix, Arizona, right here. The reason for that being is that in Phoenix, it is pretty much sunny year round. And so that day-to-day variability doesn't exist, but you have, of course, still much less light in winter time than you do in summertime. So that daily light integral greatly affects how your crops are going to grow. And to illustrate that, this slide right here has a time lapse of the growth of Rudbeckia seedlings. And the plants that you see on the left, they were grown without supplemental light. They got an average daily light integral of 5 moles per square meter per day. while the plants on the right, they did get supplemental light, and they received a daily light integral of 12 moles per square meter per day. And so my graduate student, Claudia Elkins, took images of these plants on a weekly basis, and you can see the differences in growth that you can get from providing more light. You can also see that we are not really good at growing these seedlings, because when you look at the uniformity of these seedlings in the left side image, it's not very good. So clearly this indicates that, yes, providing supplemental light and providing a greater DLI can really speed up the growth of these crops. But one thing that we are at least equally interested in is how you provide that daily light integral. So this slide right here shows control plants without supplemental light on the left, and then these other 4 trays of seedlings, they were grown with the same daily light integral. That was 12 moles per square meter per day in all cases. But we spread out that supplemental light over different amounts of time. So these plants right here got 12 moles per square meter per day in just 12 hours each day, which means that they got a pretty high light, instantaneous light intensity. Well, these plants, they received light for 21 hours a day, and that means that to reach that daily light integral of 12, they got a much lower instantaneous light intensity. So we spread out the light basically over a much longer photo period. So if we just look at the plants that were all grown with the same amount of light, as you can see in this picture right here, you may be able to see that we generally get better growth as we expand the photo period. But again, keep in mind that the plants here did not get more light. The light was simply spread out over longer periods. And so Claudia, at the end of the production cycle, measured the dry weight of the above ground parts of the plants, and what she found was that as we go from a 12-hour photo period to a 21-hour photo period, we got a 33% increase in above ground biomass. So basically, in the case of Rudbeckia, that's pretty much all leaves. Of course, when you're growing seedlings, what is perhaps more important than the above ground biomass is what happens to the roots. And so with longer photo periods, we also saw that we got a 22% increase in root dry weight. And here at the very bottom, you can see how low the root dry weight was of those control plants that were grown with only 5 moles per square meter per day. Those plants looked pretty pathetic. We have done similar trials in the greenhouse with lettuce. For lettuce, we went with a little bit higher daily light integral, 17 moles per square meter per day. This was work done by my former PhD student, Jeff Weaver. And so you can see here the above ground dry weight of these lettuce plants for the control plants, which got 7.9 moles per square meter per day, compared to 17 moles for all of the other treatments. And what we found was that, again, with longer photo periods, we get much better growth. In this particular case, we saw a 43% increase in growth, even though we provided the same amount of light to all of those plants. These are benefits that you can get from simply expanding the photo period. So all of this work was done in the greenhouse. We have done similar trials in our mini plant factory that we have built in a walk-in growth chamber. So Shane Palmer, a master student in my lab, did a study with lettuce and Mizuna under sole source lighting, again looking at plants grown with the same amount of light but provided over different photo periods. And for both lettuce and Mizuna, we saw about a 15% increase in above ground biomass for those plants as the photo period is longer. And so one thing to keep in mind, that an additional benefit of using longer photo periods is that you are providing the supplemental light at a lower light intensity. And that means that you don't need to install the same number of light fixtures. So if you are growing a crop that can tolerate these really long photoperiods, the capital expense of your supplemental lighting system can be reduced by using longer photoperiods. And that will also help with crop growth. So related to the daily light integral, we also try to answer a very different kind of questions, and that is, how do plants actually respond to fluctuating light? This was work done by my master student, Rukaya Buyan. And the reason that we wanted to look at fluctuating light levels rather than constant light levels, which we use in most of our studies, is that if you have variable electricity prices, it can become really beneficial if you can provide that supplemental lighting during times of the day when electricity prices are lower. Now, based on previous work that we have done in my lab, that was done with work done by Jeff Weaver, he showed pretty convincingly that theoretically it should be optimal to provide completely steady light levels over the course of the entire photo period. But we wanted to test how important that really was. So Rukaya grew lettuce under sole source LED lighting in our indoor plant factory. And what she did was adjust the light intensity that the crop received every 15 minutes. So it was alternating between high light and low light. And I want to emphasize here, on average, all of the plants received the same amount of light, which you can see here. For example, here we have a treatment that for 15 minutes would not get any light, as right now, while for the next 15 minutes, those plants would receive a light intensity of about 400 micromoles per square meter per second. The plants up here right now are getting 40 micromoles per square meter per second, but then in the next 15-minute period, they would get 360 micromoles per square meter per second. And so in all treatments, on average, these plants receive 200 micromoles per square meter per second. So any of the differences that we see in the growth of these plants is not related to the difference in the amount of light that these plants received over the course of their whole growing cycle. It's a response to the fluctuations in light level that these plants were experiencing. And it did turn out that these plants do not really like large fluctuations in light level. So the picture on the left right here, the plants at the top, these are lettuce plants that were grown at a light intensity of 200 micromoles per square meter per second during the entire photo period. It did not fluctuate. The plants at the bottom, they were in the dark for 15 minutes, then at 400 micromoles for 15 minutes, and then that kept alternating, and those plants were clearly not very happy with those kinds of lighting conditions. They were very chlorotic, they were very small. You can see the chlorosis in the data that is shown right here. We have the chlorophyll content index, so a measure of how green these plants are on the y-axis, and our treatments. On the x-axis right here, with the 0-400 here, indicating that these plants were in the dark for 15 minutes at 400 micromoles for 15 minutes, and likewise these plants right here in the dark, at 40 micromoles for 15 minutes, and then 360 micromoles for 15 minutes, etc., until we reach the plants at the very right, and they actually received 200 micromoles throughout the entire photo period. And so what you can see is that with these really extreme fluctuations in light, going dark light, chlorophyll levels were very, very low. With the fluctuations between 40 and 360 micromoles, we saw a little bit lower leaf chlorophyll levels than in the other treatments, but there was no difference among any of the other treatments. There were differences between the two cultivars. We used Little Gem, which is a pretty dark green lettuce, and we used a green salad bowl, which is a lettuce that produces pretty light green leaves. So Rukaya also measured the leaf area, which you can see at the top, as well as the dry mass or the dry weight of these plants. And what is clear from her data is that, again, with these very large fluctuations in light, 0 to 400 to light dark, these plants grew very, very poorly. They stayed very small. There was a little bit of a growth reduction when the light level fluctuated between 40 and 360 micromoles, but at smaller fluctuations in the light level, which is these other 4 treatments, they all grew essentially the same. And from looking at them, you could not tell the difference between them. So what this clearly shows is that these plants were actually very able to tolerate all kinds of fluctuations in the light that they were provided, as long as they don't get too extreme, which is not what we were expecting, but it is good to see, because this means that that really does allow you to take advantage of variable electricity prices in a plant factory, because it's not all that important that you expose these plants to the same light intensity all the time. So related to the daily light integral, I want to again emphasize here that how that light is provided matters. If you can use longer photo periods and lower instantaneous light levels, and almost all of the crops that we have tried, you get more growth when you do that with the same amount of light. One thing that you need to keep in mind is that, especially if you're producing photoperiodic crops, you want to make sure that you don't trigger premature flowering by exposing long day plants to long photo periods. So these longer photo periods may not be feasible for all different crops. And then, as Rukaya showed, plants can actually tolerate a pretty wide range of fluctuations in light level without any detrimental effects on crop growth. And so that does indicate that it is perfectly fine to adjust the amount of supplemental light that you are providing based on real-time prices of electricity. So as part of this project, we also want to help you develop the tools to implement these kinds of lighting strategies. And in my opinion, developing controllers that can provide supplemental light in a more efficient or more intelligent way is something that has been really overlooked so far. So there are a few companies that have developed lighting controllers that can actually measure the amount of sunlight that is present and adjust light levels, supplemental lighting, based on how much sunlight you have. So one example of that is the Smart Pass system that is developed by Lumigrow, and I'll disclose my conflict of interest here. So Candidus is actually a company that I co-founded with today's host, Erico Mattos, but we have developed this controller that can control third-party lights and implement smarter lighting strategies than what is typically possible using the hardware provided by lighting companies or greenhouse control companies. We are, as part of this project, also developing even smarter controllers, and this is work that is going on in Javad Mohammed Pourvelny's lab at the University of Georgia, and he actually has now developed at this point in the lab, using a small microcomputer right here, a control system that can automatically implement optimal lighting strategies based on real-time electricity pricing, as well as make forecasts about light intensities in the greenhouse and take that information into account with regard to how supplemental lighting should ideally be controlled. So we hope to be able to publish this research soon, and hopefully the industry will pick up on this work and develop the next generation of smart controllers. Okay, then the last topic that I want to cover today relates to far red light, the good, the bad, and the ugly. And I have some of all of that for you today. So far red light, I think, has gotten a bad rep because of multiple things. First of all, until pretty recently, there was a common misperception that far red light is not photosynthetically active. And this curve that you see here shows the photosynthetic efficiency of different colors of light, with far red being here at the far end of the spectrum, just borderline of what we can actually see. And so this research done about 50 years ago indicated that far red light does not have much photosynthetic activity, but that research was based on providing far red light by itself. And we'll see in a minute that that has some real shortcomings. The other common misperception that exists regarding to far red light is that if you include far red light into your light spectrum, is that you get lots of stretching of your crops, and that stretching may result in poor quality plants. So one thing that I would like to emphasize is that plants are actually very used to being exposed to far red light. So this line right here shows the spectrum of sunlight that I measured outside of my lab at one point. So we have 400 to 700 nanometer light right here. This is the light that is typically considered to be photosynthetically active. And then within this red box, we have the far red light. And as you can see, sunlight contains a lot of far red light. So the idea that somehow plants are going to be of low quality if you provide them with far red light seems a little strange to me. And as we will see, if you misuse far red light, yes, you can grow some very, very ugly plants. But if you use it wisely, it doesn't have to have a negative impact on plant quality. So first of all, I want to talk a little bit about the role of far red light in photosynthesis. That is based on work that was initially done by Shuyang Zhen when she was my graduate student. She is now at Utah State University and has continued some of this research. And this graph right here shows the photosynthetic rate of lettuce plants as a function of the light intensity on the x-axis right here. And in this particular example, the light that was provided was a combination of red and blue LEDs, but it looks nearly identical when you use white LEDs. And then she added far red light to the red and blue light. And so if far red light does not have any photosynthetic activity, this curve shouldn't change. But what Shuyang found was that adding far red light to red and blue LED light or to white light can increase photosynthesis, and especially at the lower light levels, which are commonly used for supplemental lighting, that increase that you can get from including far red into the lighting spectrum, that can be pretty substantial. And with percentage-wise, a much lower effect when you are at high light levels. So Shuyang, after she graduated from the University of Georgia, went to Utah State University, where she is now working with Bruce Bugby, and she has continued this line of research there. And what she has shown very convincingly is that far red light, and we're talking about light from 700 to 750 nanometers here, is just as photosynthetically active as light from 400 to 700 nanometers, or the traditional definition of photosynthetically active radiation. So it may be time to reconsider the definition of photosynthetically active radiation. So one thing I want to point out is if you provide far red light by itself, it will not be able to drive a whole lot of photosynthesis. The effect of far red light is synergistic with that of white or other colors of light. So you need to have the combination. Now, I promised that I had some ugly too. Mary Lewis, when she was an undergraduate student at the University of Georgia, she is now a PhD student in the department. She did some work with trying to use far red lighting to induce faster flower development in short day crops. And we were working with marigolds. And what Mary did was expose these plants to a high intensity far red light right at the start of the nighttime. And you can see in these pictures what she actually found. So first of all, our goal was try to induce flowering. And you can see that in these plants that got 15, 30, or 60 minutes of far red light at the start of the night period, yes, these plants did indeed flower more quickly than plants that did not get far red light at the start of the nighttime. But you can also see that these marigolds stretched like crazy. It would be nearly impossible to ship those plants, and even if you were able to ship them anywhere, I really doubt that anyone would be willing to buy them because those plants were unable to actually stand up on their own. So if you don't use far red light correctly, it can induce really negative effects. But Eric Runkle, working with, for example, lettuce, has shown that you can induce larger leaves, which can help with crop production. And we have done some work with digitalis seedlings grown in our plant factory. Again, work done by Claudia Elkins. And here we see crops that were grown with a very small amount of far red light, a medium amount of far red light, and a high amount of far red light. And with far red light, those plants grew substantially faster. They're not just taller, they're just bigger. And that is also reflected in the size of the root system. So here we have the plants grown with a low amount of far red, a medium amount of far red, and the high amount of far red. And hopefully you can see that we get a much better root system here with providing a lot of far red than we did without including that far red in the light spectrum. So that led us to try to address a different question, and that is, what is actually more efficient or better for growth? White light, far red light, or what kind of a combination might be optimal? And so Reeve Legendre in my lab, he's a PhD student, did work on growing lettuce seedlings under a wide range of photosynthetic photon flux densities or light intensities with different amounts of far red to try to answer that question of what is more efficient to drive growth of plants. So here we see how a lettuce plant that is grown at a low light intensity and with a low amount of far red light grows over a 25-day period. Because these plants got very little light, they didn't grow very well. But if we then provided more far red light, as you can see in these images, the plants did get substantially larger. They also got really leggy. These weren't exactly high quality plants. But if we also look at plants grown on the high amounts of photosynthetically active radiation or high intensities of white light, we can still see that here the combination of high white light and high far red results in substantially more growth than high amounts of white light and low amounts of far red. So Reeve made a 3D graph to show the effect of far red light on and photosynthetic photon flux density or light intensity on the dry weight of these plants as well as leaf area. Looked very similar. And from this graph, what Reeve was able to calculate is actually that far red increased growth per unit light that was applied or per photon twice as effectively as white light did. That doesn't mean that you don't need both of them, but adding a substantial amount of far red light can enhance growth more efficiently than adding the same amount of white light. Paul Kusuma at Utah State University has done some work with lettuce in different ratios of white light and far red light as well. And you can see here that if you choose the different ratio, like we have right here, a lot of far red and a low amount of white light, you can do some pretty horrible things to lettuce seedlings. but you can also see here that if you have a high amount of white light providing more and more far red, actually does increase growth. So from this work, what we have been able to conclude about far red light is that it is photosynthetically active, it enhances growth, and it does that synergistically with white light or red-blue LED light. It can induce negative morphological effects if you provide too much of it. So that is something that you need to keep in mind when you consider using far red light. We also have done a number of trials in greenhouses with far red light, and that I'm not showing you any of the data because that was really boring. Far red light, as far as we have seen and others have found the same thing, it has no benefit in a greenhouse setting, and that is likely because sunlight already contains so much far red light that adding more far red through your lighting system does not provide benefits. But in my opinion, when you are looking at a lighting system for indoor production, you probably should have far red light included in that spectrum. And I would suggest that maybe 15 to 20% of the overall amount of light that is provided should be far red light. And with that, I have covered the topics that I would like to cover today. I would like to fund the various agencies that initially funded my lighting research. And I would especially like to thank the USDA, which provided the funding for Project LAMP. And with that, I hope that there are some questions or comments that we can talk about. Thank you.
Wow, that was a lot of information, Mark. Thank you so much. 3 great topics you cover, at least, I would say. And I'm sure we're not going to have time to go through all the questions. We have a lot of them. So I think I'll pick a few on the different areas that you cover, and let's see how much can we get done here. So thank you so much for the presentation. First one, it's about this last part of the presentation, the far red light. So question is, looking at the electricity costs and biomass increase using far red light, do you think it is beneficial to use? So now bringing the costs of providing the far red in addition to the benefits that you mentioned of the crop.
Yes, so I do think that far red is economical because far red LEDs are actually almost as efficient as red LEDs. So there isn't really much additional cost associated with using far red rather than red, blue, or white LEDs. I certainly think it's economical. Perfect.
So another one relating to the spectrum of light. So the attendees just thank you for the presentation, and the question is, has been any research on plant response to fluctuations in light spectrum over the photo period? I'm thinking mainly in greenhouses where you have sunlight and supplemental lighting providing different spectrums and spectral fluctuation to the use of lighting controllers, for example, threshold and dynamic dimming.
So I am not aware of any research that has looked at dynamic control of spectrum over the course of a photo period. We have done work with different spectra, and in a greenhouse we've actually found that it doesn't really matter, and the reason for that being that it seems that sunlight overwhelms any of the effects that we might be able to induce by playing around with spectrum. So we often see that when we work in growth chambers, spectrum can have big effects on plant morphology, but those effects are typically not seen when you go to the greenhouse.
Okay, so let me change topics and then I can go back later, but we did got many questions about temperature. You haven't mentioned that, but I think people are just trying to understand the underlying conditions of the research. So I got several questions about if you're changing the temperature between different experiments with the photo periods. Do you have any comments about the temperature on the experiments? Because we got several questions about that.
No, so what we try to do in our studies is maintain temperatures that are typically used for those particular crops. When you are using supplemental light, and you should take into account other production factors, and temperature is one of those. Perhaps an even bigger one is CO2 enrichment. If you are using supplemental lighting and you're not using CO2 enrichment at times that you don't need to vent your greenhouse, you're not really going to get the full benefits of the supplemental light. If you have a poly house, for example, CO2 concentrations inside of a poly house can drop very dramatically in wintertime because those houses tend to be really, really sealed. So CO2 concentrations may drop to as low as 200 parts per million, while ideally you would want to use CO2 enrichment to maintain 800 parts per million. And when you're using CO2 enrichment, the optimal temperature for crop production might increase as well. So all of these factors really interact with each other, and the simple answer, I'm afraid, is not really possible.
Sure. Another question now on the DLI. So the question is, what could be the physiological mechanism behind the higher biomass production with longer photo periods with the same DLI?
Okay, so that's an easy question for me because we spend a lot of time working on the physiology of that particular problem. So the bottom line is that when light intensities are lower, plants are able to use the light that you provide more efficiently. And so if you extend the photo period and decrease the light intensity you provide, plants will be able to use that light more efficiently for photosynthesis than if you provide that same amount of light at higher intensities over shorter photo periods. We've published a few papers on that already, and that effect is really pronounced. So it's all about efficiency.
Perfect. So now a question going back to the beginning of the presentation when you're talking about the calculations of cost of supplemental lighting. So the question was if the tools that you are developing, if they have or if they will have the ability to take in consideration off-peak hours and real-time pricing. You mentioned about the equipment being developed at UGA, one of the engineers that can respond to that, but would that be included into the tools that you are developing to be online?
So not at this point, but we would really like to be able to do that. It makes the software much more complicated, but we found a database that actually has information on variable pricing, and we hope that in the next iteration we will be able to incorporate the potential cost savings that you could get from taking advantage of variable pricing. We're not there yet.
Perfect. So this question, I think you mentioned a little bit on how to compare, but we also got a lot, I don't want to go down that road, but we got a lot of questions on what would be the best light fixture on the market. And we try to avoid those type of recommendations. So I think that I will just tweak the question a little bit and say, what would you suggest growers should look for if they have to decide on a light fixture? How to compare, what they have to look for to come to this realization? What would be better for them?
So there are a few obvious things that you need to look at. One of them is the cost of the fixture, of course, and then you want to look at the efficacy of the fixture. And efficacy would be reported in either micromoles per joule or moles per kilowatt hour. And first of all, if you are working with a lighting manufacturer and they don't know what the efficacy of the light is, that makes it really easy because then you are done with that particular company. Then, I mean, they are not serious. But so, in principle, a higher efficacy is better because it is going to reduce your lighting cost. But typically, lights that have higher efficacy are also more expensive. So there is that trade-off. And then what you need to think about is the spectrum of light. So in principle, lights that provide red and blue light can have a higher efficacy than lights that provide white light. That's just based on the physics of how that light is produced. But you also need to think about what kind of a work environment does that result in. If you're growing indoors and you use red and blue LEDs only, I personally would not be able to work in an environment like that. Some people tolerate it quite well. even in a greenhouse, for me, it's difficult to be exposed to just red and blue light rather than white light. So that is a consideration that doesn't go so much towards how you grow your plants, but more about how your labor force actually is able to function under that light. And then this is my own personal opinion. If you are going to install LED fixtures, I would ask the lighting company for dimmable drivers that are going to power those lights. Because if you have dimmable drivers and you can dim your light fixtures on demand, you have a lot more functionality built into your lighting system, and it costs very, very little additional money. So many companies equip their light fixture standard with dimmable drivers, but some companies do not.
Sure. Another question. So before we go to the next one, Mark, do you have about 5-10 more minutes? Can we go into 3:10?
Yes, I do. Yeah. Perfect.
3:10 for our time, right? Yeah, there is still many questions we're not going to be able to do at all, but we have some more interesting questions here. This question that is very interesting, it's about the far red effect. So the question is the effect of far red assisting on photosynthesis an indirect effect due to the higher potential of capture light from other spectrum due to the stretching of leaf area? And I would just add to that. So besides that, do you think this higher biomass production from the far red is coming from the extra photons or this morphology aspect that is induced by the far red light, or maybe both?
That's a really good question, and that is the exact topic that Reeve in my lab has been working on. And it is a combination of the two. What Shuyang Zhen showed very clearly when she was in my lab as well as at Utah State is that far red light will directly increase photosynthesis, and we've published, Shuyang has published 3 papers on that particular topic. It's a misconception that far red is not photosynthetically active. When you combine it with other wavelengths of light, far red is very active with regard to photosynthesis. But an additional benefit that you can get from providing far red light is that it can induce a shade response in many crops. And that means that those plants, because they perceive that they are being shaded because of the large amount of far red light, they start producing larger leaves to try to capture as much light as possible. And I like to compare leaves on plants to solar panels. The larger the leaves or the larger the solar panels, the more energy you can capture. And in the case of leaves, the more photosynthesis you get and the more growth you're going to get. So it is a combination of the two. Really good question.
Perfect. So one more question in this topic, then I will change the topic, which is for the far red, and we got several questions around that. I'll try to make a compilation of the questions, but the goal here is, the question is, if you consider the far red into the commercial fixtures, then the efficacy of the entire fixture goes down because right now it's not being considered. And then people has always this battle, right? Do I go for a fixture that does have the far red, but then has a lower efficacy? Would you include far red or not in a commercial fixture? How do you go about that? The general consent is that it reduces the efficacy of the fixture when you add far red light.
Yes, that's also a really good question. So it points out a problem with the way that we calculate efficacy of light fixtures. So efficacy is defined as the amount of light or the number of photons from 400 to 700 nanometers that are produced per unit energy that is used by the light. And so if you include far red and you're producing photons around a wavelength of 730 nanometers, in standard efficacy calculations, that far red light is ignored. And the reason I think that we define efficacy as photons from 400 to 700 nanometers divided by energy use, it's based on the idea that far red light is not photosynthetically active. But as Shuyang has shown, far red light is just as active photosynthetically as what the traditional photosynthetically active radiation from 400 to 700 nanometers. So I think we really need to revisit the definition of efficacy, because with the current system, I think lighting manufacturers are going to get punished for including better fixtures, for producing better fixtures that include far red light. And that's something that we really should be changing.
Yeah, I agree. And it's good to have this communication with the certification agencies, the ones providing recommendations and rebates and so on, and the qualifications, so they are aware of what's being done.
Yeah, that's a real problem, because for a lighting company, there's a problem to include far red LEDs in the fixtures, because the efficacy numbers are going to go down, but the light is actually better. Yeah,
you're right. So changing topics here now, Mark. Again, several questions around that. I'll try to do one big one. Lots of questions regarding the impacts of everything that we showed today, controlling DLI, the spectrum, the intensity. What are the impacts, or if there are any, you want to talk about on flowering and fruiting? You present a lot on the biomass production. There are so many questions about that. So is there, you mentioned about the long day plants a little bit. Is there a way to summarize that, or have you seen anything regarding impacting fruiting and flowering when you're controlling all these aspects?
Yes, we've done work with petunias, for example. And so with petunias, if you give them longer days, they're going to flower more quickly, and you get more flowers. Is that a good thing? It depends on what part of the production cycle you are in. So if you are growing, let's say, petunia seedlings, you don't want them to flower. So providing long days to those seedlings might reduce the quality, because you get premature flowering. But if you're finishing petunias, then you might want to have relatively short days for maybe 2 weeks, and then switch over to longer days to produce lots of flowers on those plants as they are being finished. And so those responses are different for every different crop, which is one reason that I did not want to go into that into too much detail. But you have to think about the consequences of your lighting strategy on the flowering of your crop if you're growing some kind of a photoperiodic crop. And of course, certainly in ornamentals, probably, well, the majority of things that we do grow, they are photoperiodic, and that is an important consideration.
Sure, thanks. Many questions about cannabis. I don't know if you want to go there, but there's one that I think could be, it's a good question that would apply for all the crops. When you talk about the DLI control and having the different photo periods, providing the same amount of DLI through different number of hours, I think the question was for cannabis during the vegetative stage, but we could generalize for other crops. What is the balance between the morphologic effects that you might see, like stretching, for providing lower intensities during longer period of time, so lower intensities, longer periods of time, versus the biomass that you gain? Have you seen anything there, Mark?
So I haven't done any work with cannabis, so I don't know how cannabis would respond. In lettuce, we do see a bit laggier growth with longer photo periods and lower instantaneous light levels. While with digitalis, we did not see any negative impacts. There was no stretching of those plants. So it's a response that seems to be really species specific, and I truly have no idea how cannabis would respond.
Great. Mark, we got 10 minutes after the hour. I want to be respectful for the audience and your time as well. We do have several other questions, but I would stop here because you can just get going. I would like to ask you, is there anything else you'd like to comment, let the audience know about your work, about the project, anything else?
Yes, so if you would like to get more information about what we do, the website is on this last slide. I forgot to include the email address for the project, but the email address is info@hotland.org. That is really important for the scientists working on this project, that we know the needs of the industry. So if you have feedback, please send an email to info@hotland.org. so that we can consider your comments and suggestions as we move forward. We still have over 3 years left to go in this project, and we want to be flexible to make sure that we meet your needs. So I would also like to point out, as a very last point, there will be a follow-up survey that is going to be sent out soon, and we would also appreciate it if you could reply to that survey.
Great, Mark. Yeah, and there is an automatic email that goes from all the participants as well from the Zoom webinar platform. We can make sure we get the information, the info email. So if people want to get in contact with you, they could provide you feedback on top of the survey. I'd like to thank you so much. It was a great presentation. We had great attendance, so many questions. So for those that did not get the questions answered, we'll get all these questions and forward them to Mark. So see if we can work on getting some of those answered, if not all of them. I do thank you, not only Mark, but everybody who joined. Thanks for the attendance. And I hope to see you on our next webinar coming up next month with Roberto Lopez and Kelly Walters from MSU, Michigan State University. Thank you so much and have a good day. I see you in a month from now. Bye-bye.
Thank you all.
Thanks, Mark. Bye.
Bye.